Welcome back to the Food Forest, everybody. Today we're going to talk about guilds. I'm going to give you some examples of different permaculture guilds that you can set up. They're going to be cold hardy, cold climate specific fruit tree guilds. And this has been a video that's kind of been a long time coming, but I haven't made it yet for a couple really good reasons. So we'll get into that right up front in this video really quickly, and then we'll go around, tour my property, and show you some examples of some guilds that you can use in your own permaculture food forest as you get started. This should be a really fun one. It's probably going to end up being a longer one because I really want to get into some details in this video. So those of you who like long videos, this will be a real treat. Stick around, guys. Now, if you're new to this channel, my background is in science. It's in engineering. And a big thing that I try to do on this channel is to teach, not just the what we should be doing, but the why that we should be doing. I think it's really important because I want to create a bunch of problem solvers out of my audience. One of the biggest traps that people get into when they learn about permaculture for the first time is they hear about these things called guilds, and they think there's some kind of like magical combination that they have to unlock in order to have a functional guild, and that's absolutely incorrect. So before I go anywhere, let's talk about what a guild actually is. A guild is nothing more than basically just planting in the way that nature plants in the real world. Nature doesn't just put an apple tree at 30-foot centers and that's all there is, grass in between them. Nature doesn't do that. And if you let that system go without human intervention, that whole system would turn into a really diverse, complex, grassland, emergent woodland ecosystem. And there'd be thousands of plants all throughout the entire system. So a guild is just humans trying to reproduce that, because that's what permaculture is all about. Permaculture is all about looking at nature is the most regenerative system on the planet, and we can learn a lot by watching what nature does and then replicating and mimicking it. So a guild is basically that in a nutshell. We are trying to replicate a dense polyculture. Polyculture means multiple plants. So a dense, diverse, lots of variety, host of plants all kind of working together. And the idea is that the efficiency and production of the whole system is greater than the sum of all the individual parts. It's all those plant symbiotic relationships that we want to get feeding off of each other, and each plant is making everything around it stronger. So the reason I've been so hesitant in making this video is because the last thing I want you to get out of this video is to go to one of my guilds and replicate that guild. An apple with a cherry, with a sea buckthorn, with a currant and comfrey. You can use those plants in your systems, but I don't want you to think that I need to take this and photocopy it on my land. That's the last thing I want you to get out of this. The one thing I want you to get out of this is that you should plant plants, observe your land, observe which plants do well, and then evolve your guilds over time. You're not going to get this right. That's the biggest thing. You're not going to get this right off the get-go. Nature's going to feed you back information. And it's all going to be about how do you take that information and turn that into a stronger and stronger system overall. So with that disclaimer and caveat out of the way, let's talk about what makes up a guild. It's not just a collection of plants, it's a collection of plant functions. So what we want to do is select plants that encompass the various functions that we want our system to do. So let's talk about the plant functions that make up a guild. So when we're thinking about the different functions that we want our plants to do, we need to think about what the end goal is. The end goal is basically to produce a healthy plant that produces food for us and food for nature. In order to do that, we need a bunch of functions. So let's start by looking at this serviceberry guild that I have here on the corner. And one of the most important functions that we want to do in our system is we want to grow plants. In order to grow plants, we need fertility. In order to create fertility, we need to protect the soil life. So every single guild will be planted densely in a way that very little sun is reaching the surface. The plants are growing up and they're reaching for that sun, but the soil is not getting sun. This is super important for maximizing the amount of water that you're retaining in the soil, and water is the source of all life. The more shade you can get down at the soil level, the more active your soil food web of life is. So one function of any guild is to build soil, and we do that by protecting. We do that in a bunch of ways, but one of the ways we do it is by protecting the soil level. So all guilds should have in them a ground cover and herbaceous layer so that there's no sun reaching the soil. Now, the nutrients that the plants in this guild are using to grow are basically coming from the topsoil layer. And one important function that we try to add into many guilds are deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulators. So this mullein here, it's a wonderful companion to this guild because mullein has a really, really deep taproot. Most of these plants, the tree included, are fairly shallow rooted plants. And this mullein will drill a very deep taproot and get lots of nutrients from below the root level of all of these plants. And even if I didn't do anything with this mullein plant, at the end of the year it will live, die, fall over, and a new mullein plant will grow from the millions of seeds that this thing puts out. If I did, however, want to build soil even faster, then I can always take these leaves off, chop them off. This is great tea, actually. And I can use them to drop them down and cover the soil, and this will actually turn into more topsoil over time. It's also going to shade the soil and protect it as well in the meantime. But this will actually decompose. And the nutrients that made up these leaves, some was coming from the topsoil because the mullein does have some roots in the topsoil layer, but a lot of these were from way deep below the other plants in this guild. So a lot of those nutrients were dredged up from deep below, put into this leaf, and now this leaf is in the topsoil. So this mullein is acting like what we call a deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulator. And the idea for these plants is that they're going to capture nutrient that's basically sinking into the center of the earth. It's going to put it in its leaves, and then even if we don't do this and chop and drop it, over time this plant is now, all this nutrient is above the soil level, and this will fall down and basically return to the topsoil. So deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulators act as nutrient cyclers, getting nutrient from deep below, putting it back into the topsoil, and they're fantastic topsoil builders. So this is function number 2 that you want to get into your guild: a dredger, a nutrient cycler, a deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulator. Now right next to this mullein, situated in between 2 other fruit trees, is a nitrogen fixer. So this is role 3 that you would want to get in a food forest guild, is nitrogen fixation. Now the main nutrient that plants use to grow their green leaves is nitrogen. A big source of the nitrogen that plants get is actually from the rain. The rain falling through the sky, they scrub nitrogen out of the atmosphere and then splash it down on the ground, and nitrogen gets in. The other source is just living creatures urinating essentially, and then also living and dying and decomposing will add nitrogen into the soil. However, if you want to boost your food forest guild, you can add plants that are nitrogen fixers. So what's a nitrogen fixer? Nitrogen fixers are plants who have developed a symbiotic relationship with a root bacteria, and they can pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it down into the roots, and the bacteria in the roots will form root nodules, and they're like these little crystal clusters of nitrogen. And in this way, the plant can actually service all of its needs of nitrogen from the atmosphere and not deplete any of the soil. Now, one major misconception about nitrogen fixers is that they then return that nitrogen to the other plants around them. And that can be true, but what has to happen in order for that to be true is the plant must be cut. All plants will try to maintain a ratio of mass above ground and mass below ground. It's just how the plant balances itself. And when an animal comes by and gobbles up a piece of grass, the roots of the grass die back. Now, this dieback happens because the plant needs to balance itself, but one of the reasons that it happens is because all of its photosynthesis battery basically just got cut off, and it needs to grow more matter. It needs to grow more photosynthesis solar panels, more leaves. And where's it going to get the energy to do that function? Those leaves have mass, they have matter. It takes energy to form them into leaves. It takes that energy from the roots. So what happens is the plant's roots will actually send energy from that and use that energy, stored energy, in order to create more leaves. So when we cut a plant, the roots die back and the plant regrows. This can actually be very healthy for a plant. In fact, it's why they say to mow your lawn often and then mulch with the leaves to leave that organic matter down to return to the soil. But it's why they say to mow your grass often, because that kind of cycling is how the plant evolved. Plants evolved to have animals grazing them. And the ones that survived the most and then passed their genetics over the millennia are ones that could handle that really well. And more than handle it, they could thrive based off of it. And in this way, they outcompeted other plants. So plants do like to be cut. And when we cut a nitrogen fixer, all those little bacteria nodules, those clusters that are on the roots, they actually get disassociated from the roots, and now they decompose. Now the crystallized bacteria will have their cell walls rupture, and they'll return that nitrogen into the soil as a slow release fertilizer for everything around it. So to have a nitrogen fixer in your system, you're going to boost the fertility of the system, but only if you cut it. Okay, so here's some clover, and we'll dig it up and we'll see if we can see any of those root nodules. Do you see those little white clusters, those white nodules? Those are essentially the crystallized bacteria root nodules, and that's the nitrogen. So when we come by and we cut this plant, say we mow it or we graze it, then all of these root clusters below the ground will get disassociated and they will return to the soil as a fertilizer for other plants. Okay, so here we have a guild with a serviceberry as an overstory tree and a sea buckthorn as a nitrogen fixing shrub layer, understory tree layer. And if you've seen my video on sea buckthorn, the healthiest berry on the planet, I adore this tree. It's one of my favorite fruits, but it's a nitrogen fixer. And in order to get the nitrogen fixation that we need to cut the tree. Pretty extreme, I know. But the thing is nitrogen fixing trees are pretty good at regrowing from a hard cut like that. That tree is going to sucker a bunch. I can further cut the suckers over the next couple years. And for this season, that was a male plant, and it has already pollinated the female plants. So that's how we release nitrogen if we use nitrogen fixation in our guilds. So now we've talked about functions that add fertility to a system. Let's talk about the next thing. We want our trees and nuts to produce a crop for us. In order to do that, they need to pollinate. So somewhere in our system, we should be planting plants that help attract the insects that will pollinate our fruit for us. So there's really no secret to this. It's really just not forgetting to plant flowers. So you can see that over time I've added more flowers into my food forest system, right next to a currant bush, right in between an elderberry, and a peach. And including these flower layers are how we get more pollinators basically having a food source at all periods. Now you can say that fruit trees themselves will flower and there'll be a pollen source for insects, but how much pollen is this peach tree putting out right now? Nothing. And this pear tree? Nothing. So you should always be scanning across your system looking for potential sources of, open flowers and pollen that insects can get at any time. It's not about having a one dose shot of pollen for them to be able to get. It's about having something constantly in bloom that they can forage and feed themselves on. Because we want these insects to not just pass by and pollinate our lands. We want them to pollinate our lands, love it so much here that they start laying eggs and they naturalize in our soils. And now insects have a pretty long range, so this isn't something that needs to be intricate in every single guild, but it should be on your property. So if you want to do a wildflower hill and it's somewhat close to fruit trees, then you don't necessarily need to cram your fruit trees full of flowers. You probably still should, but as long as you have some food for them somewhere, they'll find your trees. We've planted a plant, we've got it to produce flowers and get pollinated and produce fruit. Now we want to get that yield, so we're worried about pests. So the next thing we're going to do is try to confuse the pests. So pests find our plants by smell, and they can smell them from kilometers away. So what we want to do is mask the smell of our plants by putting smelly plants next to them. Stuff like herbs. So most culinary herbs, they actually are used for cooking because they've got tremendous aroma and flavor. So most culinary herbs are going to be a fantastic plant to use in order to confuse your pests. So this right here is some mint planted right next to our currants and our elderberry and our sea buckthorn. Here right next to this pear, we've planted some sage. So sage is a very smelly plant, and pears get a lot of codling moth and plum curculio here. So if we can hide the pear from these pests, then maybe we can reduce the pest pressure. Additionally, right next to it is some Queen Anne's lace, I believe, and this is another smelly plant for insects and also attracts predators. And in fact, something is having a party. These guys are having a party. Sorry for the X-rated film. If you know what these are, let me know in the comment section. Now I talk about this in a lot of videos, but part of having a healthy, balanced system is a balance of both predators and pests. You need to have some pests if you're gonna get predators. If there's no food for the predators, you're not gonna get them. So it's not about preventing any predator damage or any pest damage on your food. It's not about not losing a single apple to a plum curculio or a codling moth. It's about balance. It's about not creating shrink swell problems by removing all the pests. That bug that I just showed you, I don't know what it is. I'll probably go look it up and find out what it is, and let me know if you know what it is. But I'm not worried about it because I don't touch them. I let nature take its course. And if I have a pest problem, my solution is to bring in more aromatic confusers and bring in more pollinator attractors that also attract pests and predators. Now, if you're on a smaller scale, like you're in a suburb or something like that, you can't control your entire ecosystem, unfortunately. So you having a hands-off approach when 99% of the people around you don't, it's not really going to help you, because if someone else is spraying all their pests and killing them all, then all the predators aren't going to be around your area no matter what. So the next cycle of pests, when they all hatch, there's no predators to eat them and they swell into problem levels again. And then people spray them again and there's no predators, and it's this vicious cycle that continues over and over again. But if you can, try to attract predators by leaving some of your pests up. So that means if you have tent caterpillars on a tree, don't remove them all. If you have aphids, Don't remove them all. Remove most of them, but leave some up, because how are you going to get ladybugs if you never have any aphids for them to eat? So dill, parsley, oregano, any kind of herbs will be fantastic companions. And if you look at this, we've got, plants growing all up around our pawpaw tree. And if you're a predator, how are you even going to find this thing when it's surrounded by all of these wonderful plants masking it and hiding it? There's a pawpaw in there, trust me. We've got smelly Egyptian walking onions growing right up next to this other pawpaw tree, completely hiding it from pests and predators, especially during its initial years, so that it can get established, it doesn't get defoliated, and it can really have a nice early boost. Once it's up and going, it can handle a little bit of pressure. Now the last thing before we go into some examples of guilds is designing in a 3D concept using what's called the 7 layers of a food forest. So that is giant overstory trees, slightly smaller understory trees, bush layers, herbaceous layers slightly lower, ground cover growing all around the ground, protecting it, root crops, and then vines growing up it all. Okay, so that should be the completed video. I will give you a tour of different guilds that I've set up and talk about the different plants. But you know all that you need to know in order to start designing your own guilds now. Don't pay attention to what specific plants I'm putting in. Just nail all those functions. So build soil with both nitrogen fixers and deep taprooted nutrient accumulators, and chop and drop them both, especially the nitrogen fixers. Deter your pests with aromatic confusers, smelly herbs and flowers. Attract pollinators with other herbs and flowers, and try to get something blooming at all times. And then design in a 7-layer 3D system to both maximize the amount of photosynthesis you're pulling into your system, as well give your predators places to hide to ambush their prey, and then also to protect the soil from having sun beating down on it, which germinates weeds and dries it out, and winds wicking across and pulling all the moisture out of your soil. So design in a 7-layer system, and don't forget to fill and pack and cram it all in. That's what nature does, and nature is the greatest teacher. Okay, so let's go walk around. I'll show you some examples of some guilds. Every single one of these plants will be good down to at least zone 4. Maybe some zone 5, like pawpaws will be like a zone 5. Figs will be like a zone 6. But pretty much everything else I have is at least zone 4 cold hardy. But remember, you don't need to photocopy this. Any combination of plants that fulfills the functions that I already described will work. It's a tremendous guild. There's almost no concern for allelopathy. There are a few, which I'll talk about in other videos. I'll just mention it now. It's like any kind of the jugland species. Stay away from those. That's like walnut, hickory, almonds, pecans, butternut, stuff like that. Stick away from those. They produce a chemical called juglone that inhibits the growth of other plants. Other than that, there's really no companion planting guide. Most of that, like 99% of the companion planting stuff you see on the internet is bull. It's garbage. Ignore it. Throw it all out. It is case by case. Something did well with another plant on someone's specific soil chemistry in their land. Throw all that out. It doesn't matter. There's no secret combo that you need to unlock. You just need to get the functions in there, and then you need to fill in the 3D space. That's tricky enough on its own, so don't overcomplicate it, because you can paralyze yourself with this analysis thinking that you have to get it right and perfect. And remember, no matter what you do, nature, every great plan survives until first encounter with the enemy, and then throw it all out and think of a new plan. So that's going to happen here. You're going to plant stuff, it's going to die. Just because it died at the beginning doesn't necessarily mean it won't be good down the road when your system changes, because you're doing massive dynamic changes to your land. Your soil chemistry is going to change tremendously. Your fertility is going to get ramped up tremendously. So plants that don't do well in their first or second years, maybe try them after 3 or 4 years. They might actually do really well. And other than that, we overplant, we oversow, and then we let nature sort it out. We let nature decide what plants really want to live, and the plants that want to die, we let them die, and we replace them with plants that want to live. So we oversow, and we really blah, blah, blah. I'll cut it right there. That's where I'll cut it. And all my guilds, they're constantly evolving. They're not perfect. They're always going to be changing. And one thing to really remember is when you see a really nice guild and it looks fantastic, everything's doing really well, there's survivorship bias that you're seeing. You're not seeing the dead plants that went into evolving to that point. You're not seeing the things that didn't survive. You're only seeing the survivors. So it's not like I just planted this stuff and it's just magic and everything worked. I'm not some kind of plant god that is really good at this. I'm learning as I go. I'm only 4 or 5 years into it. And when I started, I had zero experience in this. So if you have zero experience in this, trust me, you can do everything that I've done on my land on your land. So let's get going. Okay, so let's start with this pear tree guild right here. This is a bosque pear, and it's going to be the overstory tree. You don't necessarily always need an overstory and an understory tree. Sometimes you can just go with an understory, which will then de facto become your overstory tree. But you don't necessarily need to have a giant nut tree over them all. That's just what nature will do, you know, after hundreds of years. So here we have, as the large dominant centerpiece tree, we have a pear. And then next to it, we have a nitrogen fixing bush slash tree that's going to, you know, kind of compete in that vertical space with it up to a point, and then the pear gets obviously way over it, and we'll start shading this out. This is sea buckthorn. Sea buckthorn is a berry crop, and it's a tremendously healthy berry. It could go toe to toe with any berry for the title of healthiest berry on the planet. And it's a nitrogen fixer. So you saw me earlier in this video cutting that tree in order to release nitrogen to the rest of the system. Not this tree, but another one. Then as a deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulator, we have comfrey. It's probably my favorite plant. It's bulletproof and it grows tremendously well. And there is a nutrient analysis of the nutrients inside comfrey leaves from Zimbabwe. If I remember, I'll post the link to the research in the description below. If I forget, remind me and I'll add it. And this is a tremendous nutrient accumulator. This plant bioaccumulates many different trace minerals and nutrients and it gets them deep down in the topsoil. So it's not stealing nutrients from the plants, it's actually taking it below ground, bringing it up, and then depositing it into the topsoil where the fruit trees can get at it. So these are plants that I chop and drop quite often. You can step on them to break them. That keeps the flowers alive for the bees. That's probably the optimal way. It'll also increase shading to the soil. Or you can do absolutely nothing with it. These comfrey will live and die, and they'll kind of flop over like this one here behind me. They'll just flop over and they'll become like this, and then you clean them up at the end of the season, just drop them back down on the ground, or turn them into compost and then put the compost back into your system. Then we've got a rhubarb. Rhubarb is performing several functions. It's a shade soil, it's a soil shader, it's a deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulator, and it's got actually such large leaves that if you plant them at the drip edge of the tree, so this is kind of the pear tree here, and if you plant it right at the drip edge of the tree, then those large rhubarb leaves will stretch out, and any raindrops that would miss, you know, the area of the tree will hit them, get funneled back and pulled towards the tree. So in this way, it's a rainwater accumulator and concentrator for this pear tree. So anytime you can get a big leafy plant, and you can see now that I mentioned that, you can see where the comfrey are planted, and you can start to see that there's methods to the madness. There's methods to the crazy planting, and that these comfrey also act in that way as giant nutrient accumulators. So then we've got bush layers in there as well. We've got currants. These are some red currants, and we've got elderberry here, and in the back, if I pop back in here, we've got some serviceberry right here. We've got another serviceberry there. We've got flowers. So these are some black-eyed Susan. They're special prairie fire, I think it's called, something like that. These are rudbeckia. These are pollinator attractors. We've got Jerusalem artichokes here, which are more flowers basically in this row. They're a root crop as well that I can harvest, but these ones I don't, so I can chop and drop these, and I can harvest them for biomass if I want to move that somewhere else, and worst case they'll turn into nice flowers in the fall. So these are a fall flower. This here is a summer spring flower. We've got daylilies that are surrounding the area, bringing pollinators in and making sure that something's always in bloom. So this is an example of this guild. I had put strawberries in here. I can't see them. They're probably somewhere in there. We had raspberries in there. We've got some zigzag goldenrod that I transplanted from the pond just as another flower and pollinator attractor. And then we've got a ground cover of creeping Charlie, which is in the mint family and is a smelly plant. So it's kind of acting actually as a somewhat valuable deterrent for all of the smells of the system to hide these. We've got some suckering sea buckthorn here that this is kind of what sea buckthorn does. This is a root runner coming from that host plant over there. And this is what the one that I cut down will do tremendously over the next year, is they'll send up all these little runners. All these runners are attached with a long root all the way back. So with minimal soil disturbance, I can jam a shovel down there and I can jam a shovel down here, sever that root, and I don't even have to chop this. I can disassociate that root and disassociate the nitrogen nodules and feed that pear tree. Or I can just chop these ground level, and that will continue suckering and disassociating all those berries. Or all the nitrogen berries, the nitrogen clusters. Then we've got some sumac growing up. This is great food for the birds. The birds absolutely love the sumac. And having birds situated, you know, this is coming from the sumac back behind me, but I've left these actually up because having a sumac, a bird-loving tree, really close to your fruit trees is fantastic because birds eat tons of pests. So in this way, when on the underside of these pear leaves, if I do get codling moth and they hatch really close to fruit, there's only like a couple hours in the day that they hatch that the birds can intercept them from getting into the fruit. So if you have birds constantly perching really close to your trees, then you can intercept that pest cycle and break it. We have other things in there as well that I've probably forgotten. We've got some hascap bushes here that are gonna, grow up and be 6 feet wide, so that'll help fill in this space. We've got garlic and onions. I pulled some garlic out. We've got some Egyptian walking onions you can see here. So these are all growing. So there's just a host of tremendous variety and diversity in this whole area, and this is just one section of one guild. So you can use these plants, you can use other plants, but you just want to get as many of those functions as possible. I think what I can do for this guild, which is a common theme for most of mine, is maybe add some sage, maybe add some dill or parsley, and get that aromatic confusion boosted even more than just with this creeping Charlie. I could probably fill this and scatter this with dill seeds next year, parsley seeds, and really boost the confusion and hide this peach tree from the codling moth. One of the favorite guilds that I have is this peach tree guild. This fantastic, just glorious peach. Very, very heavily loaded, really producing for us this year. And at the bottom of this, we've got a deep tap rooted nutrient accumulator of comfrey. So that's a very common theme around most of my fruit tree guilds. We've got some volunteer mullein that popped up here, so I've let it grow. I'm hoping that it'll seed different areas around, and I can always control those by chopping and dropping them. We've got a ground cover of nitrogen fixation in this one with clover. And this is an area where we get tremendous rabbit pressure, so the rabbits actually come and eat this. They absolutely love it. And they do the work of cutting and pruning them for me. We've got a ground cover of strawberries in this guild, and dog strangling vine that always likes to creep its way in. And we've got, in the bush layer, we've got hascaps, which is a favorite berry of mine. It's kind of like a blueberry. It's very, very cold hardy, and it's not picky for the soils that it grows in. So it's a fantastic choice for a very cold hardy climate. We've got asparagus as another slightly taller ferny bush layer that doesn't shade stuff out. And we can kind of get an early season crop with the asparagus. We've got nitrogen fixation from sea buckthorn in the back there. And we had a goji berry planted next to it. And you can maybe see it, it's right there, and it doesn't like to live. So for some reason, I can't get a goji berry to grow here. And that's just kind of one of the feedbacks that I'm accepting from my land, that maybe gojis don't belong here. And like I said, I'm gonna probably give it another chance at some point in the future, and maybe they'll do better after a couple years. We've got aromatic confusers with the onions in and around there. I just pulled some garlic out of here, so there's garlic that was here that isn't anymore. So get wine cap Kingstrophoria mushrooms popping up. That's another thing to not forget about your layers, is to include as many food crops as you can from different places. And we've got tons of wine cap that pops up pretty much in this area here, all around this biochar. So it really loves this area. It's probably just like a little fertility booster. And you can see I've added in some daylilies here as well. They haven't opened up yet, but that was basically my attempt to, get some more flowers into this guild. Again, common theme, I could probably put some more herbs in and around here for some more aromatic confusion, but pests aren't necessarily that much of a problem for peaches, and we've got lots of smelly stuff all around also in other places. Asparagus is pretty smelly actually, so it's actually doing somewhat decent job of being an aromatic confuser. Okay, here is a gorgeous wild apple tree that I put in, and you can actually see that we've got a couple tent caterpillars in here, and I've removed a bunch, but I will always leave some. And it's because I want the pests to have food. I want the predators of those pests to have food. So I'll always leave some. And this thing is absolutely loaded with apples. Those tent caterpillars are not gonna stop this tree. It's doing fantastic, totally loaded up. So this is the overstory tree of this guild. Below it we've got comfrey again as deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulator. We've got hostas as kind of like a ground herbaceous layer. We have got Rosa rugosa as a pollinator attractor, food crop, smelly aromatic confuser. We've got kiwi, cold hardy kiwi. This is an Arguta kiwi growing up this apple tree and using the apple tree as a trellis as another food crop. We've got lamb's quarters as another edible herbaceous layer plant. We planted some service berries in here and they're doing okay. And the idea is that at some point I'm going to lose this tree, and I want to have something else growing right there so that when I do have to cut this down at some point in the future, I'm not going to have a big blank space. I'm going to have something else that's growing. And for now, this apple tree can nurse with dappled shade, an understory tree right next to it. We've got daylilies right underneath it as a herbaceous layer, pollinator attractor, food source. And then we've also planted a peach kind of right next to it, and blueberries, which aren't really doing well because the soil's like about 7.2 pH, so it's nothing that the blueberries want. So we've put a peach at the south side of this tree. Same idea. When this big apple tree goes, I'll have a couple trees that can take over as the, not leave a big blank space here in such a important, beautiful spot of my food forest. So even around this wild apple tree, I've been adding in elements of, trying to make a nice guild. Okay, here at the side of the pond, we've got a plum as the overstory tree. And this is a guild that I've kind of fleshed out with lots of stuff, but really the yarrow took over. I think it's on a hill. It never gets watered. So you're gonna get dry loving plants that do well here. And I think the other stuff just didn't make it. So here we've got an overstory plum with yarrow that's pretty happy, I think. We've got deep tap-rooted nutrient accumulators of comfrey. What else is still alive? We've got a sea buckthorn there for nitrogen fixation. And we've got an understory pawpaw tree planted just to the south of it, which will get plenty of light. But also, when the sun kind of gets past these sumacs, it'll get dappled shade. So it kind of gets shaded for most of the day. And everything else looks like maybe it didn't make it. We've got some comfrey that's hanging on over there. But you can see that if you just kind of overplant, then the plants that do want to grow pretty well will dominate and take over. And, you know, other plants that obviously didn't necessarily want to live, they don't get to live, and that's okay. And then I'll probably just fill this in over time with more plants. And as the soil builds over time, this is just basically brand new soil. And it was dug from very deep below, so it had very low nutrient value, no organic matter in the soil. So it's going to take time for us to build this. But that plum has really put on a lot of growth. Probably pushed up another at least 3 or 4 feet this year. This guild here with the serviceberry, I'll talk about some of the characters that are in this guild here. Some of them are not in their ideal situation yet. So this is the north side of the tree. These are ostrich ferns. This is what fiddleheads are, and these are actually shade plants. I put them on the north side of this tree and that tree to kind of get good shading, but these trees just aren't big enough yet to shade them, so they're dealing with full sun, and they're actually holding on and kind of spreading, so they're doing pretty well. But these will do really well once the shade picks up in this area. Hopefully they can live long enough for that to come into fruition. We've got butterfly weed, and I forget what these are called. I just looked them up yesterday. These are basically flowers planted in around to try to bring in pollinators. And look at this, butterfly weed. It's always a nice treat when something like that happens while I'm filming. I can kind of show you guys what it's like in this area. We've got some mint growing, doing really well. Right here, acting as an aromatic confuser. We've got daylilies. These are edible daylilies, so you can actually eat these little seed pods here. You can roast them like little beans. They got a little bit of a spice to them, but they're nice. You can eat the flowers. The key to these is that they should point up. They shouldn't droop down and hang, because there are poisonous lilies that you can't eat, and that's pretty much the telltale sign. But just be careful whenever you eat something, obviously. Got the deep tap rooted accumulating mullein. We've got another serviceberry there. We've got nitrogen fixation here in the sea buckthorn. We've got some creeping thyme here as a creeping ground cover pollinator attractor. We've got St. John's wort and wild sweet William here acting as pollinator attracting, and also smelly plants that are double as medicinals. We've got an understory tree pawpaw, and even though, you know, this is far away from that main guild over there, over time they'll really fill in. And you know, once all these plants get super large, they'll really kind of tie this area together. We've got foxglove beard tongue flowers right here, acting as just more pollinator attracting and aromatic confusion for this guild. So this is kind of like a little pocket guild on the side of a hill, and I'm just adding to it a little bit over time. So here we've got a nice little island guild that I've made right at the edge of this pond. And we've got a peach as an overstory tree surrounded by 3 nitrogen fixation sea buckthorn. And we put these here because sea buckthorn tend to kind of sucker and runner a lot, so they'll kind of stay put in this little island guild around the pond. I don't want to necessarily, I just want to be a little careful with sea buckthorn around the pond. I don't want them going too crazy. We've got more comfrey as deep tap rooted nutrient accumulators. We've got various pond plants like watercress in there. I forget what these are. These are basically a flower, so aromatic confuser and pollinator attractor. Watercress is a chop and drop nutrient builder that I can use the nutrient in the pond to kind of harvest and put. You can see that we've been putting some algae from the pond there as a chop and drop. We've got hascaps in there. We've got creeping Jenny as a ground cover. And what else do we have in there? We had some sarsaparilla in there, wild sarsaparilla. We had some sweet flag right at the edges, planted in there. So just a lot, and then lavender kind of in the back of the guild there, you can kind of see it. I wish I could show you guys how many dragonflies we have out here by the pond. It's just, I don't know if they pick up on the camera, but there are like hundreds of them all around, and for some reason they're super skittish. Whenever I go anywhere close to them, they really just take off and I can't get them. But they're like these little circling Apache helicopters that just go around eating all the mosquitoes and pests. They're a wonderful garden friend, a massively important predator. One of the biggest reasons why I put this pond in actually was for dragonflies specifically, so I'm really happy that they found it. So here's my wild and crazy front garden, and you can see this is a pretty intense, crazy polyculture here. This used to be just hydrangeas and some daylilies, and I've added in a ton of different plants. We've got grapes growing up a trellis. We've got a butternut right there, right next to the trellis. Hopefully, if this trellis ever comes down, I can use parts of the butternut in order to kind of, you know, extend the life of the trellis. It's not producing yet, but it's growing really well there. We still got the hydrangeas. We've added comfrey in. Comfrey looks really ugly right now, so if you're seeing this and you're like, oh, that comfrey plant is really ugly, I'm not going to use it. This is as ugly as comfrey gets when it's kind of dying off. You can see the new growth is coming back up down in the bottom middle there. This is just comfrey's life cycle. If you don't like this, once it flowers, you can cut it off and kind of clean it up. This is a fantastic soil building crop. And just this area of the garden, you know, I haven't really got to it yet very much. And worst case, I just leave it like this and I clean it up in the fall, and it still does its fantastic job. We've got the daylilies popping through, finding light. There is grapes there climbing up over an autumn olive tree bush. So the autumn olive is the nitrogen fixation in this area, plus clover that's on the ground that's really not doing very well with the comfrey and the hostas and all the other stuff that it's got to compete against. So the ground cover in there is obviously kind of not going to do the job, so we got to get nitrogen fixation in a bush layer. So here we've used autumn olive, and this is a tree you want to be a little bit careful of. It can be very invasive, but with the way that we do nitrogen fixing, we are constantly cutting it, so a lot of the concerns with invasiveness really aren't there with us. And this was a tree that was pulled from somewhere else, so you know, there could be a concern about birds eating berries and transplanting them, pooping them out and spreading it. It was doing that anyway, somewhere else. I'm not going to go around my county eradicating this plant, so I don't see a problem me bringing it here. It's doing the same function. It was, you know, half a mile up the road, and I brought it here so I can use it as a nitrogen fixing grape trellis. So the grapes are doing fantastic. Let's go take a look at those. And in a second, we've got more lilies. We planted some blueberries in there, and you can see they didn't do well. They don't exist. We've got some strawberries down in the middle there. We've got onions, Egyptian walking onions down in there. We've got this peach tree as another overstory tree in the future. And then this grapes, like look at these grapes. These grapes are loving this spot. Does anyone want like a few hundred bushels of grapes? Just loaded. So this grape trellis is going to be tested, and we'll probably do it a little nicer over the years. We just wanted something to get stuff going across. We'll probably make it a little nicer. Over here on the south side of the trellis, we've added in a few other things. We've got some jugland species here. I figured they're far enough away from the grapes that I can put a juglands here. And then we've got kiwi, which are actually known to kind of tolerate the juglands. This got severely browsed by rabbits, and I think it's because I didn't plant any clover in and around here, so there's no clover for them to eat. Usually I put borders of clover around all my gardens, but you can see here it's just grass, and they chose to not eat the grass and eat the kiwi instead. Whereas in other places on my property, they have full access to kiwi and they don't eat it because they'd rather eat clover. And when they eat the clover, they disassociate the root nodules from it, feeding the whole system. So, you know, clover as a nitrogen fixing ground cover is so valuable, not just for nutrient cycling, but also for rabbit deterrence. And this one here is doing fantastic. Look at that. Put on a ton of growth. This is the first year. Like you can see this whole branch, that whole thing is just this year. Really, really good. And I got Lucy. I'm sorry if I got Lucy pooping in the background. Oh my gosh. Okay, here we have a lower swale guild, and we put 2 cherries in. We actually put 3 cherries in, one there, one here, and one in the middle of these raspberries. This one got browsed really bad by deer and died. One year, very, very early in this guild, like years before I even made this YouTube channel. And then we've got another one in the back that looks like it's holding on barely. Can't even see it under this bush layer of raspberries. So tons and tons of raspberries. Interestingly enough, these ones aren't producing yet. The other ones are ahead of them. So it could be a sun issue. These might just produce slightly later. And we've got hazelnuts as an kind of an understory tree slash bush layer. They get quite big, around 10 to 12 feet. So these ones are already about at 7 feet, 8 feet. And we've got a hazelnut there, and we've got a hazelnut here, because they need to wind pollinate. So they need to be close together. And we've put more hazelnuts in this Jerusalem artichoke kind of swale here. Just on the north side of this, we've got some more hazelnuts. And I've been clearing out, I don't know if you can see little patch holes in the artichokes. I've been kind of clearing light out so that the hazelnuts still get light in with all these Jerusalem artichokes. You know, daylilies are doing really well, so I wanted to get some food for the pollinators. And kind of just color in here. So we lined it on both sides with daylilies, and I'm really happy that we did do that. The raspberries have done really well. We've got nitrogen fixing through the sea buckthorn there, and then another one here. We've got some grapes growing up them, starting to pop up. We've got some goldenrod that wanted to volunteer, and I let it because it's a fantastic aromatic confuser and pollinator attractor as well. A lot of people hate it because it looks a lot like ragweed. So make sure that you don't have ragweed. Make sure that it is goldenrod, but goldenrod's a fantastic plant. Here's a overstory cherry tree that's doing really well. This one is protected from the deer browse. It's kind of up above the deer browse, so it should be all right now. And then we've been adding in some wildflowers in here, just wildflower packets, random stuff popping up that I'm not exactly sure what they are. But this is just to kind of boost up the pollinator attractor aspect. I don't know if you can see the blue flower down in there. So we've just been throwing wildflower packets in here. We've got some milkweed to get some monarch butterflies going. And this is kind of a bit of a wild and crazy guild, but if you notice all my guilds, the wilder and the crazier that they are, you know, the more rampantly abundant they are. So that's a huge, huge tell. We've got some field daisies popping up. These are great because they'll just pop up. I don't even plant them, they'll just pop up randomly. We've got some down there. Sorry, I'm swinging the camera everywhere. Got some popping up down there as well. But you know, if you look at the health of the entire guild here, the whole system, this is one of the most, you know, healthy, vibrant, rampant guilds that I've created. And it's in a very bad sunspot. These are tall cedars to the south of them. So this is and a giant tall pine, eastern white pine, just to the direct south of them. Well, south is kind of there, so you know, they're shaded from southeast to southwest, and they're actually getting pretty good sun right now at noon on a Sunday. But fantastic guild. That one's doing really well. And Jerusalem artichokes, really nice flowers, high value crop just to the north side of them. Here's some of the hazelnut additions that I put in, and you can see they got shaded really badly, and I've been trying to kind of cut them out a little bit just to give some light to them, so hopefully they'll hold on. And then we'll get more cross-pollination. And then we've got a mulberry up here. I'm kind of far away. This isn't really in the same guild anymore, but we've got a mulberry. We've got some anise hyssop and sweet Sicily in this guild, and we've got an overstory cherry tree, and we've got clover and Egyptian walking onions, and just wildflowers. So thanks for taking this very long walk around the property with me. Let me know if this was way overkill, way too much. I know that the people who love long videos have been asking for a guilds video for a really long time. So I hope that scratched that itch. I really want to hammer the point. Don't try to photocopy any of this stuff. Try to understand the roles and the functions and put plants in your system that occupy those roles and functions. And if you need one plant somewhere, plant two, plant three. So overplant, let nature sort out who gets to live, who gets to die, and you'll have a, over the years, you'll have a very full and very functional, very low maintenance guild that will put out way more food per square foot of your planting area than if you just planted, rows of one crop or one tree and babied that tree. If you put a peach in all by itself, that one peach tree might produce more peaches than my peach. It'd be arguable, but if you count all the other crops that are in and around those peach trees, the service berries, the hascaps, the strawberries, the raspberries, the currants, the gooseberries, all these other crops are also giving me a yield. So the overall yield is way, way higher. And then you talk about different kind of pest problems that a monoculture creates. To me, this is the way to do it. This is the solution to solving 99% of all the problems you have. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you on the next one.